Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief lead writer, Sonia Sodha, and the Daily Telegraph's chief political correspondent, Christopher Hope. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. The Guardian leads with Boris Johnson admitting the NHS is under huge pressure, but is insisting England can ride out its biggest ever COVID wave. As hospitals struggle with the number of patients, the Metro also quotes the Prime Minister with the headline, "We can ride it out." The Times also focuses on Boris Johnson's belief the UK can ride out the current wave without needing any more restrictions. This is The Sun. That's also their lead. The Eye, meanwhile, goes with the announcement that 100,000 critical workers involved in food, transport and borders are to be given daily tests. COVID testing rules will be relaxed as part of efforts to shorten isolation periods and ease staffing shortages, reports the Daily Telegraph. And the Financial Times leads with the rise of travel and leisure stocks, with investors growing more confident the economic impact of Omicron is waning. And we're joined tonight, as I was saying, by Sonia Sodha and Christopher Hope. Good evening to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin with Boris Johnson's press conference, shall we? 5 o'clock this afternoon. First thoughts, Sonia, what do you think?
So I think this is the Prime Minister sort of setting out a continuation of his position, which is that Plan B is enough. So we're going to stick with Plan B. It's going to get really, really tough for the NHS. Indeed, we've already seen several hospital trusts declare critical incidents in recent days. But that's the plan, and that's what we're going to stick with. And I think this was his opportunity to sort of put a mast in the post and to say that. I think there's more data. There's more data that's come out in the last 2 or 3 days, and it's quite a mixed picture. So it really kind of depicts how this is a very, very different wave of COVID from the waves that have come before it. So there are some really good bits of news, which is what the Prime Minister wanted to focus on, which is that, it is looking increasingly certain that Omicron in most people presents as a milder form of illness. But at the same time, we are seeing this very strong pressure on the NHS. And we've seen that, in London in recent days and weeks. But now in the north, we're starting to see, I think experts are worried because hospitalisation rates are going up faster in the north than they are, than they have been in London. And also there is this key issue around staffing and the impact that staff absences, because staff are self-isolating, on the NHS. And indeed, tonight we've seen in Manchester, most hospitals across Manchester have said that they are calling off all non-urgent surgery and treatment because capacity is so low. So it's a different form of wave. Omicron appears to be causing less severe illness, but we are still seeing hospitalisations. That's still putting a huge amount of pressure on an NHS that sort of had to deal with a decade of underfunding. It went into the pandemic with a huge number of staff vacancies, and really sort of the crunch that's being applied on top of that is that there's been a huge increase in waiting lists over the last 18 months because of the pressure that COVID has put on the NHS. So you've got a health system that's trying to catch up at the same time as deal with much greater pressure than normal over the winter, which is really leading to this situation that we're seeing at the moment.
It was such an interesting day, wasn't it? Let's have a look at the Metro, the front page there. PM, we can ride it out. Let's bring that up. Yeah, there we go. We can ride it out. Christopher, it was such an interesting day because the day was spent reporting on these trusts that were declaring critical incidents. And then we had this press conference in which the PM was saying, it's OK, Plan B is working, we're going to stick to these restrictions.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it was OK. I mean, he's worried about it, and everyone's worried about it. He admitted in his press conference at 5 o'clock that parts of the NHS would feel overwhelmed. It was necessary to put the NHS on a war footing, in his quotes, with more help from the military. And everything with Sonia in her tour there of the issues in the NHS is correct. But the PM's position is, look, it's serious. but we can get through that. And we'll see later on how the financial markets are reacting to that optimism. It looks like the PM, he may just pull this off. And I think that it takes a degree of bravery, I think, to do nothing sometimes in politics. It's all very well being busy and doing things, because then you can always say, well, I did something and it didn't work. To do nothing and hope that, by that I mean to not to shut communities down like happened in Scotland and Wales, to try that and for that to work does take a degree of bravery, which he may get some credit for.
Sonia, what do you think? Do you think he will get credit for, as Christopher says, his bravery in doing nothing?
I think it's far too early to tell. I think if you look backwards at the pandemic, and I think this is the stuff that will come out in the inquiry, actually Boris Johnson has done nothing too often. So he's definitely taken too much time to introduce restrictions when there was an unarguable case for them at previous points in the pandemic. And I think, we've seen thousands of avoidable deaths as a result of that. Now, what happened in the last kind of month or so is quite different in the sense that we saw some nations, so Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, take actions, whereas the Westminster government did not. And actually, there was a much greater degree of uncertainty, I think, this time round compared to previous points in the pandemic. And so actually you can make a bigger case for, actually, I think, you can make the case for taking the action that Scotland and Wales did, but you can also make the case for taking no action, as Christopher said. So on this point in the pandemic, I think the jury is still out, but I think when the inquiry comes to consider what's happened over, the length of time that we've seen so far, I think it's unarguable that actually the Prime Minister has tended towards taking far too little action too late, which has not only led to more avoidable deaths, but has actually created bigger consequences for the economy. Because when you act late in an exponential pandemic, it leads to tougher action for longer, which is something that everyone wants to avoid.
Listen,
go ahead,
definitely arguable. That is definitely an arguable position. Look at the vaccine rollout. Look at the vaccines that they've procured. Look at the booster program. Look at the fact that the PM released restrictions in last summer in the UK, which has given a degree of herd immunity. Yes, he was late back at the beginning of the entire pandemic, but I think that's pretty harsh. That's a Guardian view, an observer view, possibly, of Boris Johnson that the inquiry may not adopt.
Christopher, let's look at your paper now. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sonia. Sorry, go ahead. Just repeat that.
I don't think it's just an observer view. I think plenty of other scientific experts have said, and I think you can maybe understand why the government got it wrong back in March 2020, but it was really around autumn 2020 where the cabinet were having all those political struggles about when to act. That is actually when I think the Prime Minister is extremely culpable in acting too late, not taking the advice of scientific advisors, and actually it led to, I think, a tougher lockdown in January to March 2021.
OK, let's have a look at the Daily Telegraph. Christopher, this is your paper. Do you want to just talk us through the front page here?
Yes, this is all about the requirement to have these COVID tests, and it's tackling the staff absences, which Sonia talked about there in various NHS trusts, and why that's having a massive bearing on whether people can have a normal elective surgery. So the idea here is there are plans being drawn up by the NHS and looking at whether PCR tests to those should only be given to those with symptoms rather than those who are asymptomatic. This might allow around 40% of cases of people to return to work more quickly. They're looking around the edges about whether I know elsewhere they're looking at whether they need to necessarily have these lateral flow tests in order to get back to work, or to find ways to double down, or whether there's a requirement to justify a positive lateral flow test. If someone is ill or thinks they have COVID, maybe don't have a PCR test to check on that. There are all sorts of ways they're trying to make these tests go further. For the next couple of weeks, there'll be quite a bite on these tests, according to Sodha, the Health Secretary. And here's one example.
OK, do you think, Sonia, do you think that perhaps this is what we have to do in the next couple of weeks, really rethink everything, how we test, how long we isolate for, and that comes from a new understanding, basically, of what this variant is doing?
Well, I think you definitely have to adapt your approach in terms of new data coming out. And I think actually this sort of proposal, which is to say, if you've not got symptoms and you test positive in a lateral flow test, you can start the self-isolation clock from that point rather than from when you get your PCR test results. Obviously, if you've got symptoms and then you get a positive PCR 2 or 3 days later, you start the clock from when the symptoms develop. So that could actually sort of save people with symptomatic COVID 2 or 3 days. And actually, I think that's quite a sensible thing to do. I think the other big debate we'll have coming up in the next 2 or 3 weeks is whether we should be reducing the self-isolation period further. It's already been reduced from 10 days to 7 days for people who get consecutive negative lateral flow tests on day 6 and day 7. Some countries, for example, the US sort of government authorities there have gone further and reduced that to a 5-day self-isolation period. Now, our government has looked at that, and in the last sort of 24 hours, 48 hours, has been pretty clear that it doesn't think that the evidence is strong enough yet. It's concerned that you would have people going out on day 6 and 7, a significant enough number of people who are still infectious to sort of outweigh the benefits of, getting an extra couple of days off the self-isolation period. But I think that's going to be a big debate coming up in the next 2 or 3 weeks, particularly as more data comes out about that. And that is definitely something to watch out for.
Let's have a look at the FT, and they're talking about travel and leisure shares. Christopher, you said we'll really see how the markets react tomorrow following that press conference. But we're already seeing here a surge in travel and leisure shares.
I often think that we overlook the FT sometimes on this kind of news when we're so busy dealing with newspapers that address the population. It's a very niche paper, the FT, but look at where the money's going. The money here is betting that the Omicron turmoil is nearly over. The worst, we're seeing the worst now, and these investors are betting on the future. I think following the money here looks like travel stocks rising sharply. This report says it may seem severe at the moment, but the financial markets are seeing the end of it, and perhaps they're taking a lead from Boris Johnson's optimism. And that's driving investors into these areas which have had such a hard time over the past 2 years. Don't forget, it's called COVID-19 because it was discovered in 2019, and now it's 2022. And the main sector that's borne the pressure on that in terms of financial markets is hospitality, travel, and leisure. So if these shares are up, maybe, just maybe, we're getting near the end of this.
Sonia, very quickly, as we're about to hit a break, what do you think? The economic threat fading?
Well, I think we all have to hope that the investor optimism is right. I think certainly with Omicron, the picture is looking more positive now. There's a little bit more certainty around that, even though there are these huge pressures on the NHS than it was sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I guess the problem with this disease is you just never know what nasty turn may be around the corner. And we don't know what sort of variants there are. But let's hope these investors are right, because I think we all want to see the end of COVID as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Fingers crossed. OK, we're going to take a quick break. Coming up, Prince Andrew waits to hear if the lawsuit against him will proceed. We'll discuss that next. Hello again, you're watching the press preview. With me now, Sonia Sodha and Christopher Hope. There they are again. Thank you both. Let's start. Sonia, will you kick us off with this Guardian story, the latest hearing in this civil case against Prince Andrew?
That's right, and it's on the front page of The Guardian, but several other papers as well. Really big story, this. So Virginia Giuffre, who is one of Jeffrey Epstein's victims, is now suing in the American civil courts, or trying to sue Prince Andrew, who she says alleges she was forced to have sex with when she was still a child, when she was 16 and 17. Now, obviously, these are allegations that Prince Andrew denies, but the thing that is working its way through the American civil courts at the moment is she settled with Jeffrey Epstein, her abuser, in a civil settlement. And as part of that settlement, which got exposed, it got published yesterday, it was previously been a private settlement, it became apparent that one of the clauses that she'd signed was that part of this settlement was that she would not take a case against Epstein's associates. Now, what that clause actually means in the American civil courts is very much up for debate. But the key thing that this hearing was focused on today was, does this get Prince Andrew off the hook from facing this lawsuit against him in the American civil courts? Prince Andrew's lawyer says that it does. Virginia Giuffre's lawyers say that it absolutely does not. Now, it's always very hard to tell what the outcome's going to be before the judge produces his or her answer. But in this case, I think some of the things that the papers are reporting on are actually, he seemed pretty incredulous at some of the statements from Prince Andrew's lawyer, that this did mean that Prince Andrew doesn't need to face a civil lawsuit. So we don't know yet exactly whether this lawsuit will proceed. If it does, it will be a huge deal for the royal family. Prince Andrew essentially facing being sued in the US courts with these allegations of sexual assault against him. But his lawyer will be hoping that they are able to make use of these clauses to prevent that from happening.
It's been so interesting listening to the arguments around what looked like a very cut and dry contract. Let's move on, Christopher, to your story, page 1 in the Telegraph. Just talk us through the pros and cons of cutting VAT on energy bills.
Well, there's been a big push here from backbench MPs on the Tory side, led by Craig McKinley, to try and do something to get ahead of this whole cost of living crisis, which we're just on the cusp of, which many in Westminster, where I've been all day, think is the big issue of the first half of this year, because there are big increases going in energy bills, notwithstanding the increase in national insurance and other areas too, in council tax and others. So there's big concerns here about this cost of living crisis. The Tories on the Tory side are trying to urge the government to do something to deal with it. And yet again, we go back into this tension at the top of government between Boris Johnson, who might be keener to do it, to cut taxes, and maybe Rishi Sunak at the Treasury, who's less keen. Boris Johnson here coming out saying, well, cutting VAT, that's 5% VAT on energy bills, would help a lot of people who don't need it, says Boris Johnson. Doesn't rule out some degree of support here for low-income families with big bills going up very shortly, but saying that it wouldn't necessarily to do it across the board. On the Brexiteer side, this could be a Brexit dividend.
Christopher, I've got to jump in there. Sorry, wait and see. We're going to take a break, but you're with us until just before midnight. Sonia and Christopher, thank you.